The history of humanity does not begin with cities or civilizations, not even with tools or fire. It begins much earlier, in the forests and savannas of East Africa, millions of years ago, when a group of primates made a decision that would change the course of the planet, to stand upright and walk erect. This gesture, simple yet monumental, would mark the beginning of a long evolutionary line that would take us from ape-like creatures to beings capable of writing poetry, crossing oceans, and sending probes into space. But to understand that transformation, we must travel to the deepest past, to the time when Earth still belonged to the beasts, and human beings were only a distant possibility. The origins of the human lineage date back to about 7 million years ago, when the first hominids began to separate from the evolutionary trunk they shared with chimpanzees. Although we share 99% of our DNA with them, at some point our trajectories diverged. This bifurcation did not happen overnight, but through a series of species that adapted to a changing world, driven by a mixture of environmental pressure, genetic mutations, and the need for survival. One of the first candidates in this line is the enigmatic Sahelanthropus cadensis, discovered in the Chad Desert. It lived approximately 7 million years ago, and although its skull retains features similar to those of apes, the position of its foramen magnum, the opening through which the spinal cord passes, suggests it could walk upright. It was not human, but it was no longer entirely ape. Other key species follow, such as Auroran tugenensis and Ardipithecus ramidus, both with evidence of partial bipedalism. They lived in forested environments, probably walked on the ground but still climbed trees. Bipedalism did not emerge as a sudden fashion, but as an evolutionary advantage in an environment that was beginning to dry out, where moving efficiently on solid ground could mean the difference between life and death. But it would be with the genus Australopithecus, and in particular with Australopithecus afarensis, that the first truly human steps began to leave their mark. Literally. In Litoli, Tanzania, fossilized footprints from 3.7 million years ago were found that belonged to a group of hominids who walked upright. One of the most famous representatives of this species is Lucy, discovered in 1974. She was little more than a meter tall, had a small skull, but already walked very similarly to us. The Australopithecines were a mixture of the old and the new. Their brains were still small, the size of a grapefruit, but their hands were capable of manipulating objects, and their bipedal posture freed their upper extremities, laying the groundwork for tool use. They lived for millions of years, coexisting with other hominid species, and adapting to various African environments. They were not a single straight line toward modern humans, but a branched evolutionary tree, with multiple species exploring different survival strategies. But the true revolution began with the appearance of the genus Homo. Homo habilis, known as handyman, emerged about 2.5 million years ago and represents one of the first real steps toward what we are today. What differentiates it from the Australopithecines is its ability to manufacture stone tools, specifically those of the Oldowan type. Simple edges, cutters, scrapers. They were not sophisticated, but they marked a monumental leap. For the first time, a species used external objects to modify its environment. These tools were not just for hunting or cutting meat. They also implied cooperation, learning, and knowledge transmission. Tool use required observing, repeating, teaching. And with that, the brain had to adapt. In fact, with Homo habilis began the process of encephalization, that is, the progressive growth of the brain. From about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters in Australopithecus, cranial volume increased to about 600 to 750 cubic centimeters in Homo habilis. More brain meant better memory, problem-solving, planning, and emotion. Then came Homo erectus, perhaps the true pioneer among our ancestors. It lived between 1.9 million and 300,000 years ago, and was the first human species to leave Africa. Remains have been found in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Its name, erectus, refers to its completely upright posture, but most impressive was its cultural and technological change. Homo erectus developed Acheulean-type tools, much more sophisticated than those of its predecessors. Bifaces, hand axes, instruments for skinning, cutting, crushing, and most transcendental, it mastered fire. Fire not only served to cook food and soften meat. It also protected against predators, allowed colonization of cold climates, and was the meeting point for socializing, telling stories, strengthening bonds. With it, primitive human culture began to flourish. In parallel, the body also changed. Homo erectus had long legs and shorter arms, adapted for walking and running in the savanna. Its pelvis was similar to the human one, and its face showed a more reduced jaw and a more rounded skull. It was no longer an upright ape, but a being that was beginning to dominate its environment. In the following hundreds of thousands of years, human evolution diversified. New species emerged and some became extinct, others migrated and adapted. Among them, Homo heidelbergensis stands out, a bridge species between Homo erectus and modern humans. It was strong, robust, with a brain of almost 1,200 cubic centimeters, and probably already hunted in groups with wooden spears. From this species would arise two crucial lineages: the Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa. Also during this period appeared a capacity that would define us forever: empathy. The first evidence of intentional burials, care for sick individuals, rudimentary art, indicates that humanity no longer just thought, it also felt. For the first time, humans began to look at the sky not just as a source of light or rain, but as an enigma. They painted in caves, decorated their bodies, left traces of their symbolic thinking. Humans no longer just sought food or shelter. They sought meaning. And so, after millions of years of evolution, adaptation, and transformation, a new species would cross the threshold. About 300,000 years ago, somewhere in Africa, Homo sapiens emerged, the man who knows. A creature that, unlike all the previous ones, would not only survive, it would conquer. But that story, of how Homo sapiens rose above all other hominids, crossed continents, faced glaciations, extinguished rival species, and built civilizations, that is a story that still must be told. Approximately 300,000 years ago, in some corner of East Africa, a new species appeared on the evolutionary stage. It was not immediately the protagonist. It was not the strongest nor the most numerous. But it possessed a unique combination: an exceptionally developed brain, advanced communication capacity, and unprecedented creativity. That species was Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens did not emerge like lightning. It was the result of a long and complex evolutionary process. Its body was similar to ours: a completely upright posture, skillful hands, finer face, more reduced jaw. But the true revolution was not physical. It was mental. This new being could imagine what did not exist, project itself toward the future, evoke the past, and emotionally connect with others. It possessed symbolic thinking. Its mind was an internal universe as vast as the world it inhabited. The archaeological record reveals that the first Homo sapiens began to create art, rituals, and personal ornamentations. Beads made from shells have been found, decorated bones, pigments for body painting, and above all, the first artistic expressions in African caves. This indicated something never before seen: a deep consciousness of itself and others. For the first time, the human species understood that it was alive, and that it could die. For tens of thousands of years, these first humans lived in small nomadic groups, hunter-gatherers who depended on their natural environment, their social cooperation, and their knowledge of the territory. They built shelters, perfected stone tools, developed complex languages, and shared stories around the fire. But the story of Homo sapiens did not stay in Africa. One of its most notable characteristics was its desire to move, explore, and conquer new territories. Thus began the Great Human Migration, a process that would change the face of the planet forever. About 100,000 years ago, the first groups of Homo sapiens began to leave the African continent. They traveled north, reaching the Middle East, and from there expanded toward Asia, Europe, and later, Oceania. It was a slow, intergenerational journey, driven by the search for resources, natural curiosity, and environmental pressure. During this expansion, Homo sapiens encountered other human species that already inhabited those regions. The Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans in Asia, and other even less understood species, such as Homo floresiensis in Indonesia. Far from exterminating them immediately, as was once believed, sapiens coexisted with them for thousands of years. They interbred, they mixed, and left genetic traces in us. Today, every human being outside of Africa carries between 1% and 4% Neanderthal genes in their DNA. But the story was not one of perpetual coexistence. Little by little, Homo sapiens prevailed. Its social intelligence, its capacity for adaptation, and perhaps its ability to construct collective myths, made it the definitive survivor. While colonizing the world, sapiens revolutionized hunting, the use of fire, bone tools, clothing, shelters, and even began to develop rudimentary forms of social organization. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and they did it as a team, with planning and strategy. But there was a turning point that would change everything. The cognitive revolution, a term that scientists use to describe the moment when Homo sapiens began to create complex narratives, shared symbolic systems, and elaborate cultural structures. The cognitive revolution allowed something unprecedented: the creation of collective myths. Thanks to them, human groups could unite around ideas, not just around biological bonds. It was no longer necessary to be family to collaborate. It was enough to believe in the same thing: a totem, a forest spirit, a shared rule, an imaginary common ancestor. This leap allowed groups to grow, cooperate on a larger scale, and transmit accumulated knowledge more efficiently. Language became more sophisticated, collective memory more powerful, and with it, humanity prepared to take another evolutionary leap, this time cultural. About 12,000 years ago, after hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, some human communities began to establish themselves in a new way of life: agriculture. This transition marked the beginning of the Neolithic. They cultivated wheat, barley, rice. They domesticated goats, sheep, dogs. And for the first time, humanity stopped following food and began to make food come to them. Sedentarism brought great changes: population growth, work specialization, resource accumulation, and village creation. And with them appeared hierarchies, inequalities, and conflicts. Where before there were tribes, now there were clans, lineages, leaders, and subordinates. The first settlements evolved into cities. And from cities, the first civilizations were born: Sumeria, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, the Olmecs. All of them developed writing, organized religion, astronomy, legal systems, and power structures. Humanity no longer lived in caves. It erected temples, palaces, and libraries. It organized around empires and beliefs. Languages diversified. Cultures flourished. History could finally be written with its own words. But this progress did not come without cost. With civilization came war, slavery, the exploitation of nature and other human beings. The same intelligence that allowed us to domesticate fire began to be used to dominate, destroy, and divide. In the last 1,000 years, humanity has advanced faster than in all the rest of its history. We have discovered electricity, invented the printing press, crossed oceans, explored space. We have written human rights treaties, designed vaccines, split the atom, created the internet. And we have also polluted rivers, provoked global wars, manufactured weapons capable of erasing entire cities. We are Homo sapiens, the only survivors of an ancient and complex lineage. We are the species that stood on two legs in a distant savanna, that painted bison in caves and wrote epics on clay tablets. The species that traveled from Africa to the moon, that simultaneously creates beauty and destroys what it touches. But perhaps the most fascinating thing is not our past, but our capacity to reflect on it. Because we are the only species, as far as we know, that can look back, understand where it comes from, and choose where it goes. Today, more than ever, we are at a crucial point. Technology has given us almost divine power, but our consciousness remains fragile, as human as always. We can build a more just, sustainable, and conscious future, or repeat the mistakes of the past on a planetary scale. Our journey began millions of years ago with creatures that could barely stand upright. Today, we look at the stars and search for other worlds. But perhaps the greatest challenge is not out there, but right here, understanding what it really means to be human. Because if the history of human evolution has taught us anything, it is this: surviving is not the same as living. And the next chapter of this story will not be dictated by biology. It will be dictated by the ethics, empathy, and wisdom with which we decide to use everything we have learned. If you liked the video, we invite you to give the video a like and subscribe to see more videos like this. Comment which documentary you want to be next.